Welcome to Nerds at Church, a podcast about nerdery and the Bible. I'm Pastor Kay, and I use pronouns like she and her.
And I'm Pastor Emily, and my pronouns are they, them, theirs. In this episode, we'll discuss the 7th Sunday of Easter, which falls on May 21st this year.
Check out the episode description for links to the Bible passages and other references we make in this episode.
For our deep dive for this episode, we are diving into ecumenical efforts to unify the church, or ecumenism for short. We are doing this in part because the readings talk about unity and holding things together and studying together, both Acts and the Gospels. So we figured this would be a great time to talk about ecumenism because it's a really important part of who we are as Christians, and particularly for Kay and I as Lutherans.
Hey, Emily, are Christians good at being unified at things?
No. No, we're terrible at it. We're absolutely horrid.
But we try.
We do try. And unity is not the be-all, end-all.
No.
We do not want you to hear us say that. That's not what we're trying to get at. But there are a lot of places where we can find places to come together and to work together to be partners in ministry, in worship, in all sorts of things.
Sure.
So, according to Wikipedia, ecumenism is the concept and principle that Christians who belong to different Christian denominations should work together to develop closer relationships among their churches and promote Christian unity. So, in case you didn't notice, there's a lot of the word Christian in there. Ecumenism specifically focuses on Christians, followers of Christ, the Christian churches, that kind of anyone that falls in those categories.
You know, it occurs to me that probably other religions that have experienced some sort of splintering effect over the years probably have efforts in those religions.
Which is like all of them.
Yes, to unify as well. And they probably have words other than ecumenism, and I don't know what those words are. So if you know, please let us know, because education is good.
Mm-hmm. It's true. So a couple terms that sometimes also get mixed in with ecumenism. One is interfaith. So as Christians, when we talk about being in relationship and working together with people of non-Christian faith traditions, we're talking about interfaith relationships. For the most part, that's basically like any of your big major religion, any other religions, right?
But we hear about the big ones.
Judaism, Islam, Hinduism, paganism, Wicca.
We should put more
Buddhism,
effort into working with the Sikhs, because
Sikhism.
the Sikhs, there's always food. I'm in favor of that. Like, let's really put our money where our mouth is. Wait.
Yes, Sikhs are fantastic.
Yes.
One of the trickier places that it depends a lot on your denomination, and as Lutherans, we're in a murky place, but like the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, the LDS Church, or Mormons, depending on who you talk to, is ecumenical interactions or interfaith interactions. That particularly comes from the Book of Mormon and the way that the Book of Mormon is viewed and held up within the LDS Church, which varies between people and has changed over time. So that's a tricky one. Having been a Lutheran pastor in Utah, it's especially tricky because national church politics don't always take into account that local context. But so that's kind of like when we talk about interfaith, that's more what we're talking about is relationships between Christians and non-Christians. And potentially that includes atheism and agnosticism, but that has to be defined and understood by atheists and agnostics.
Sure.
So like Christians don't get to call the interaction interfaith if that's not how an atheist or an agnostic would actually talk about it. So just to put that in there. The other denomination that's kind of a tricky one is the Unitarian Universalists, which we'll talk about a little bit more, but that in and of itself is in many ways an interfaith denomination.
Yes.
Or multi-faith might be a better word for it. And then the other term that sometimes gets confused when we talk about ecumenism and churches and denominations and all of that is the term non-denominational. Many of you have probably heard of it. There are a variety of different congregations, especially like megachurch or evangelical or fundagelical congregations that call themselves non-denominational. First off, denominations are not inherently evil.
No.
It is helpful to have some sort of outside accountability.
Bureaucracy.
Right?
Yay.
When harm happens. Yeah.
Sometimes paperwork is a good thing. Only
Accuracy.
sometimes, but sometimes.
But yeah, it's not perfect. And both Kay and I know how, like, the ELCA is not perfect, for example. But I had to do specific things before I could become a pastor to make sure that I was less likely to harm parishioners. And so that's a benefit of denominations a lot of the time. Non-denominational, a lot of times, is just like secret Baptist.
Yeah.
Most congregations, if you dig deep enough, you can figure out that they are associated with some group that is larger than them. It's not always affiliated like a denomination. Sometimes it is. Sometimes they are Southern Baptist and they just don't want to say it out loud. But usually there is something that they're connected to. A lot of the times it is more conservative than the people who are attending and worshiping there and part of the community realize.
Yeah.
And that has problematic impacts, particularly for queer people.
Transparency is good.
Yes. Transparency, good. Murder, bad.
I mean, sure.
I just
I love our catchphrase, but we hadn't really gotten to murder.
It's true, but there's a lot of murder that has happened between Christian denominations.
Well, yes, that's definitely true.
So, Yeah, so those are just a couple of the key terms when we talk about ecumenism that we wanted to make sure we kind of spelled out for folks so that you can understand. If you have questions about any of them or want to know more, feel free to send us your questions and we will reply to them as best we can.
Sure.
Or look up the information and then reply to them.
Please keep in mind that, a lot of times when we're looking things up, we use Wikipedia. Wikipedia is awesome. But...
Shh, don't.
No, if we tell them, then they can answer these questions for themselves. Information literacy is important, Emily. So.
Okay, I guess.
So, why would we put all of this effort into ecumenism and ecumenical efforts? Well, for some of us, the answer is the creeds, especially for those of us in mainline Protestant denominations, like Emily and I being Lutheran. The Apostles' Creed includes a statement of faith in the one holy Catholic Church, Catholic with a lowercase c, just meaning universal. And the Nicene Creed includes a statement of belief in the one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church, Catholic again being lowercase c. And we are working towards being truly one church again. The aim to reunite the many splintered churches of the world. Because we recognize that the church started out as one group. And it would be nice if we could all work together on a reasonably level playing field again. But also, there's a lot more of us now. We understand that this is complicated, so obviously this is all going to take a while. I have definitely heard Christians talk about the concept of one unified church in terms of this is something we will reach shortly before Jesus comes back. We don't expect this to happen tomorrow.
I was going to say part of it too is when we read in the epistles, Paul talks about the body of Christ and being many members of one body. And so part of it is not just we get rid of all of our differences and agree on all of the things. It is recognizing our differences and the ways that that makes us a better body of Christ.
Exactly.
That it is our differences. Not our differences in who is a valid human and deserves to be alive. Not those differences, but differences in nuances of theology and experiences of the Holy Spirit. All of that can really make our experience and our witness as Christians
absolutely
better.
So, speaking of differences between Christian denominations, not all Christians have creeds. So there are some Christians who don't do this because of the creeds, obviously. But also, a lot of us would like to be able to work together better, and being one in Christ, as the New Testament frequently refers to it, is important to most of us. So that's why we're putting all of this effort into this. And speaking of what that effort is, we have lots of examples for you.
Mm-hmm. And I will say one example of the denominations that don't have creeds is the Christian Church Disciples of Christ, which is its own merger. But part of what they do that to hold the space for a variety of different understandings and beliefs and expressions of Christianity. But also then they have I think the Lord's Prayer is what they use. So they do still have something that ties them to
Sure.
other denominations more explicitly.
The Protestant version of the Lord's Prayer, I'm guessing?
Yes.
With the extra bit at the end.
Yeah. So it's also kind of hilarious because we hold these creeds as really important and as like impetus for unity and ecumenism. And at the same time, they have actually also caused schisms. So, as Kay said, in the beginning, we had like one group of, 12 to 70 people who made up kind of that first group.
That's a very solid baseball team in the big inning.
Yeah. And then it has been splintering kind of since then in different ways. So, one of the big splinters was the Great Schism, which happened around 1000
1054,
between 1054, there you go, between Roman Catholics and Orthodox denominations over the part of the creed that says "and the Son" in the Nicene Creed. So there's also that, right? There's ways that the creeds unite, and then there's also like the is the Holy Spirit from the Father and the Son, or just the Father?
Sure.
And then the many reformations that we've had, that sort of thing. Those have all been like ways that the church has splintered. And now, in the last 100 or so years, 50 to 100 years, we've been doing a lot more merging as the Christian church. We're also still splintering, but a lot of merging of denominations has also been happening.
Absolutely. So speaking of merging, both Emily and I know something about how that works because both Emily and I were alive the last time that Lutherans merged. Although
just barely.
I wasn't really paying a lot of attention myself. But in 1987, the ELCA was formed as a merger of about 4 predecessor denominations. I think there were also like a handful of individual congregations that like hopped over to join us too. It was kind of a mess.
Probably.
And when these organizations joined together, they picked from all of the different organizations' polity, which is to say their systems of organizing the church, and that also became a bit of a mess because as we look back, it seems like we picked the worst parts of all of them. But I'm sure at the time they didn't think they were doing that. I'm sure at the time they were trying to, even-handedly choose things from all of them so that we could all take an active part in the new denomination.
I think they were trying to appease everyone and therefore made it nearly impossible for everyone.
Just ask Neville Chamberlain.
It's my theory.
Yeah.
I mean, other denominations that also are mergers that we're particularly aware of, the UCC, the United Church of Christ, is a merger of the Congregational Christian Church and Evangelical and Reformed Church. And that merger actually happened in 1957, so 30 years before the ELCA merger.
They're old. Sorry, they're experienced Christians. And, not all mergers last forever, and so I'd just like to throw out a shout out to the Methodists in the lives of both Emily and I and our listeners. Maybe be extra nice to Methodists in your life. They're under a lot of stress right now. And while technically I believe the splintering is still unofficial, they've got a big meeting coming up and they're really freaked out. So,
yeah. And this is in the United Methodist Church, which, as the name suggests, has been very, very committed to unity globally.
As a worldwide communion, yeah. And unfortunately, that is kind of falling apart in the United States right now, for the most part.
But with global implications, because they're a global denomination.
Yeah.
So one of the other mergers that is unique is the Unitarian Universalists, which we talked a little bit about, that as they exist now, they have some kind of core beliefs and values that they have, but you can be atheist, agnostic, Christian, Jewish, Hindu, any religion, and also be UU. So that's a unique place where they are Christian-ish, and where when we talk about ecumenical engagement and interfaith engagement, it depends a lot on kind of how they're feeling about it at the time. I think for the most part, I would default to interfaith just to be safe, but they originally were a merger between Unitarianism and Christian Universalism.
Sure.
So they do have their origins in Christianity, which has various implications for their own responsibility in like Christian harm, but they have gone in a new direction.
Yeah.
Not like the band.
No.
That was a good one.
I don't know that Harry Styles isn't involved in ecumenical efforts, but like I haven't heard anything.
Mm-hmm.
Also, I haven't been looking, to be entirely honest. Full disclosure. So
that's fair.
Yeah. So speaking of specific examples of ecumenical efforts, one that you, let's be honest, probably haven't heard of is called the Joint Declaration on the Doctrine of Justification, also known as the JDDJ, which was a statement about 20 years ago that the Lutheran and Catholic churches wrote together, and that has since expanded to have the Methodist, Anglican, and Reformed World Communions sign on to it, agreeing with it. And what this is a document that explains how our churches believe what's called justification, which is to say the forgiveness of sins by God of humanity, how we think that works, essentially. We're confirming our shared theologies. And so the fact that the Catholic Church was willing to admit that they agreed with the Lutheran Church on how that worked was extraordinary. And since then, the Methodist, Anglican, and Reformed churches have also signed on to it, which is great. And that means that we are better able to share more theological ideas with each other and learn more about each other and have better relationships with each other.
Yep. And that's the particular doctrine that they're talking about, the doctrine of justification, comes from Martin Luther's justification by grace through faith. That's the thing that we're talking about that people are signing on to.
Sure.
So, fun story. When I was in seminary / college, somewhere around there, something happened and the Catholics were being a little nicer to Luther / acknowledging that Luther was not a terrible human being.
Maybe we shouldn't have chased him through the forest and tried to kill him. That was probably wrong.
Yeah, maybe he had a few good ideas. And so in her mind, it translated into they were unexcommunicating Martin Luther, which translated into the Catholics and the Lutherans were getting back together. She's very Catholic. And so she was talking to me about it when I was visiting her at one point, knowing that I was going to be a Lutheran pastor.
Sure.
And she was like, so I think the Catholics and the Lutherans might be getting back together, but the Catholics are going to have to do something about priests because they're going to have to let women be priests now. And it was just the most adorable at the time affirming thing that my super Catholic grandmother could say. It was totally off base on the reality, obviously, because we have just spent probably too much time looking up to see if Martin Luther was actually excommunicated or just talked about it.
Well, no, he was definitely excommunicated.
Or unexcommunicated,
yes.
or just talked about. But it was just this beautiful moment, and where my grandmother was then the Catholic Church is going to have to do something about women. And she was part of a group of wonderful women who, most of whom probably would have been priests if they were allowed.
And speaking of the Catholic Church softening up and being nicer to other Christians, the Catholic and Coptic churches, you may have seen a recent news story about the two of them sharing saints between the two denominations. Although, to be strictly honest, the Catholic Church refuses to refer to itself as a denomination because that would imply that other churches are also, correct. But
existing.
Yeah. But in 2015, 21 Orthodox Coptic martyrs were killed for being Christian. And Pope Francis, very recently, I think in the last few days actually, has said that they will be added to what's called the Martyrology, the list of martyrs for the Catholic Church, which is extraordinary. It is the first time since the Great Schism that these two churches have shared saints. And as I found in one article from the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops, during ecumenical meetings and prayer services, the secretary of the Promoting Christian Unity's Catholic subgroup said, "It is common to commemorate informally saints and martyrs of another tradition, but there never has been a decision to put them into the Catholic Church's martyrology, thus formally including them in the prayer of our church." So this is a big move on Pope Francis's part and an
Mm-hmm.
encouraging sign of ecumenism.
Yeah, for sure. And if you want to know more about martyrs, you can check out our episode from the 6th Sunday of Easter this year, where we dove deep into martyrdom.
And for the record, neither of us is laughing at the concept of martyrs. We are laughing at Emily's continued excellence in the role of transitioning from one topic to another, and also bringing up other deep dives we've done.
I was going to say, I thought it was the, like, excellence in hashtag shameless plugs.
Yeah, that's pretty much what that's actually going on. Yeah.
From a podcast in my podcast. Yeah. And we'll link to that in the episode description as per usual. There are also other denominations. So while the Lutherans and Catholics flirt.
Oh, I don't know that's, I mean, I've met too many Lutherans and too many Catholics to be able to be entirely, yeah.
Okay, but while they do their dance, the ELCA in particular is one of the denominations most well known for its ecumenical efforts. So the ELCA actually has full communion agreement.
Which means that we can share pastors and the sacraments with.
Mm-hmm. So, to be clear, full communion agreement is not about who can receive communion in these denominations. Each denomination has their own things about that.
Yeah.
It is that Kay and I, as clergy and other clergy, can serve in other denominations. For example, right now, I am serving as pastor in a Lutheran church and an Episcopal church at the same time.
Sure.
And my presiding over the sacraments is understood to be valid.
Yes.
And in good order.
Unfortunately, this does not mean that we are actually taught how these other churches do communion, and therefore the one time I ever tried to do communion in a Presbyterian church, we were all very confused by the end. I am still not clear on how any of that worked, but we tried, and in the end, everyone got communion, and that was the important part.
I have done it in Presbyterian churches, and that is pretty easy to figure out. I've done it in Methodist churches, pretty easy to figure out. Episcopal churches, you really have to know because there are very strict rules, and almost all of it is kind of written, but not exactly.
Also, it's possible that these Presbyterians were, like, maybe there's not one standard Presbyterian way. Maybe it was just this particular Presbyterian congregation. But.
Yeah. Presbyterians tend to be very congregationalist.
Yes.
So it changes a lot. But, so, the denominations that the ELCA, the Lutheran church that we're a part of, is in full communion with are the Presbyterian Church USA, which is PCUSA.
Also known as not Timothy Keller.
I don't know who that is.
He's like the other Presbyterian church's most famous, like, guy.
The PCA?
Yeah.
I was going to say, part of what is important and why I'm both saying all of the words and spelling it out, the acronyms for you, is because most denominations, like the ELCA, there are other denominations within that big name, right?
Within
like the ELCA calls itself Lutheran, but there are a variety of different Lutheran denominations, and they are not all the same. So the PCUSA is more progressive than the PCA.
Sure.
That sort of thing. So PCUSA is who we have an ecumenical agreement with. We also have ecumenical agreements with the United Church of Christ, the UCC, the United Methodist Church, the UMC, the Episcopal Church USA, ECUSA, the Reformed Church in America, RCA, and the Moravian Church. We also have a really good and strong ecumenical relationship with the ELCIC, the Evangelical Lutheran Church in Canada, and the Episcopal Church in Canada.
Yes.
That the 4 Lutheran Episcopal denominations in the US and Canada actually have like signed a whole like joint 4-way polyamorous like
it would be totally awesome if we could share health insurance, but that's just my own personal pipe dream. Also, shout out to the Moravian Church, because not only are those people awesome and they have a really interesting way of approaching communion, but also they don't use acronyms. And it is just a sweet and blessed moment when you get to, not have to deal with that. So I'm sure they have acronyms they use, but not for their church.
Mm-hmm. And the ELCA also has like conversations and dialogues in process with, I think, the African Methodist Episcopal Church and some other denominations. Yes. That is part of the steps towards a full communion agreement.
Yeah. Yeah, in theory, at any given time, we're working on ecumenical agreements with all kinds of folks, really. Just whether or not we're making any progress is a whole separate question. But we're trying.
Truth.
And there are several ecumenical organizations around the world. Two of the biggest and best known are the World Council of Churches, which is made up mostly of mainline Protestant organizations and faith traditions, but the Catholic Church does send observing delegates to their meetings. They are centered in Geneva, Switzerland. I actually got to visit the headquarters there when I went on my one international trip. We actually had our seminary class in their building. They share a building with the Lutheran World Federation, oddly enough, which is the Lutheran global
sense.
building. Yeah. And also, like, I think some other organizations.
The Lutheran World Federation, for folks, is a Lutheran World Federation.
Thank you.
It is a collection of Lutheran denominations throughout the world.
Yes.
Not all Lutherans are part of it.
Right.
But that is like the closest we get to...
That is the ELCA one. And there are a few other Lutheran organizations that are global ecumenical Lutheran organizations that say, like, there's one that the LCMS, the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod, belongs to that we do not, and so forth. I had to research that once as part of, I think, that actual class. But the World Council of Churches dates back to 1948, just after the war. And also a much older organization, the World Evangelical Alliance, which is a international group of evangelical churches, and they date back to 1846. So they are old hands at that.
Yeah. And the World Council of Churches in particular is the one that Kay and I are obviously most familiar with. But they do a lot of really good work in terms of justice work globally and advocacy work.
Yeah.
Yep. And they have, at least in the United States, a national branch, right? Like there's the National Council of Churches, which is associated with it, but for the United States.
Yeah. And there's a National Evangelical Alliance, which is associated with the World Evangelical Alliance. So
there you go. And then there are also less formally ecumenical justice movements in this country in particular. So thinking about the Poor People's Campaign would be a really good example of that. That it is a collection of all sorts of different Christian churches, leaders, denominations that have joined together to be part of the Poor People's Campaign. Full disclosure, the ELCA voted no because we're racist. And
I mean, we didn't include that in the statement of why, because we're not that honest with ourselves. But, like, functionally speaking.
Yeah, we didn't want to agree to be held accountable to anyone but ourselves for an organization of...
Which is quite Lutheran of us, but yes.
Yeah, I was there. It was bad.
Yeah.
But we, like, different synods and congregations do participate in the Poor People's Campaigns locally and nationally.
Sure.
And we are a fan of them, and we'll link to them so that you can learn more about them if you
Yeah, because you can participate individually whether or not your church is involved.
Yep. And whether or not you're Christian. Like...
Absolutely.
The Poor People's Campaign originally started with Martin Luther King Jr. and Reverend William Barber has restarted that, and it is this like beautiful, powerful organizing group that could use all of our support. One of the other ecumenical justice movements is Christians Against Christian Nationalism, which is something that the ELCA more recently kind of signed on to, and that is to specifically combat all of the Christian nationalism that is happening right now in the world and the ways that Christianity is being used to harm and is being used to prop up white supremacy, neo-Nazis, white nationalism, anti-Semitism, all of those things.
Murder bad.
Yeah, murder bad. Hey, look!
We did get there.
I knew we'd get there eventually. So Christians Against Christian Nationalism specifically, like, tries to work against that and to help people understand the harm of Christian nationalism and the like things that lead to Christian nationalism, because a lot of people don't realize how easy it is for white people in particular to be radicalized into Christian nationalism.
Yeah.
And then the third one that we're talking about, there are certainly many more than this. There's a lot of work around immigration, around environmental justice, all of those things. But the third one that specifically we're talking about is the Institute for Welcoming Resources from the National LGBTQ Task Force. And that is an institute, an organization who specifically provides resources, but also connects the different welcoming or open and affirming or reconciling organizations within different denominations. So, for example, Reconciling Works, which runs the Reconciling in Christ program in the Lutheran Church, but more light would be the Presbyterian equivalent. Open and Affirming is UCC and Disciples of Christ. Reconciling Ministries Network is Methodist. All the different denominations have their own kind of version of it, but it is a way of naming and being held accountable for affirmation and celebration and inclusion of LGBTQIA plus people as full and active participants at every level of participation and leadership in a congregation or a church organization.
Yeah.
So we'll link to all of those for you if you want to learn more about any of those. And we'd love to hear what your favorite ecumenical justice movements are.
Absolutely. And if you're looking for further useful information on the concept of ecumenism and so forth, we will also link you to an article from the Encyclopedia Britannica's website, and, of course, one from Wikipedia, because we are nerds at church and there are certain things that we will never not do. But we hope that those can be helpful for you, and we also continue to pray for Christian unity, because goodness knows splintering hasn't really gotten us much of anywhere. So...
It's true. Also, we didn't talk about it yet, but there are a lot of like pop culture references that tug at our ecumenical heartstrings. For example, if you ever watch anything with me that involves a wedding or a funeral or a church worship service, I will have opinions. And those opinions will vary depending on like if and how like they denominate themselves, right? But, like, I will have opinions if you're wearing pink on Christmas Eve as a Catholic priest.
Yeah.
You know?
No. I mean, like, no. Like, pink socks would be fine. But not vestments, no.
Yeah.
Although now I suddenly want for us to do a Patreon movie commentary on 4 Weddings and a Funeral, because that could be fun. But
we could totally do that this summer, I think.
I have not watched that movie
for
a
long
time.
Yeah. Yeah, we should do that. If you want us to do that, let us know, and we will probably do it anyway if we remember after recording this episode.
Sure.
But yeah, there's a lot of ways that Christianity, and particularly clergy, are represented in pop culture, and a lot of it is really terrible. If you ever need a Christian clergy version of a sensitivity reader, I don't know what it is. Like, they get scientists and lawyers and stuff all the time.
An accuracy expert or something like that? Yes.
Yeah, an accuracy expert for what you're doing. We know right now is the writer's strike, and we are super in favor of the writer's strike. But when y'all get back to work, if you're doing anything with Christianity, Christian clergy,
or if
worship,
you're writing a novel and you're not actually part
or
of
writing
the WGA.
a novel,
yeah,
any of that, please reach out to us.
We would be happy.
We would be happy to be paid to help you do this.
Or we'd be happy to help you find the right person if that's not us. Because let me tell you, I don't know anything about how the Presbyterians do communion, so you don't want to ask.
That's fair. But yeah, please ask us so that we can help you do it well. Also, anytime there's a pastor, just stop using the cishet white guys.
Yeah, absolutely.
We've got much more diversity, and it is helpful to see that diversity in social media. Yeah. I don't know of any explicitly ecumenical interactions, though, as much as like just a variety of vaguely Christian.
Yeah, well, now that you've been talking about accuracy of Christian portrayals in media, I'm flashing back to Seventh Heaven and how that church was not Methodist at all. But yeah, I mean, the theology was pretty reasonable for the most part, but the portrayal of what the church services actually would have looked like.
Works.
No. You don't get to hire your daughter. That's not, nope. So.
Yep. Yeah. That is true. Although I did love Seventh Heaven growing up.
There were parts of it that were really good. Yeah.
Yeah. You know, there's also like actors that were terrible to the kids involved. So.
Not great. And, for that matter, while we're talking about portrayals of Christian clergy in media, if you're watching an NCIS episode, at least from the first, 6 to 7 seasons, because I think that's what I've watched over the years, if you see a clergy person, I think there is a grand total of 1 clergy person that I remember in an episode who doesn't turn out to be a murderer. So, just keep that in mind. I'm just saying. And that was the Catholic priest that Kate was hitting on, so...
So, murderer or unavailable love interest.
Yes.
Gotcha.
To be fair, he was cute. But still, no.
I think I've said this before, but in Grey's Anatomy, I call Grey's Anatomy Call the Chaplain,
Yes.
because the vast majority of the plot would be taken care of if people actually called the chaplain. And like there are like maybe 2 or 3 times that anybody suggests calling the chaplain, and the chaplain is always unavailable. And the one time that I think they get a chaplain is for a wedding of staff. So it's not even like,
yeah, no,
somebody is dying in the hospital and they want to have this meaningful thing because they've been engaged or whatever. But like,
right.
Yeah, that one I'm just like, y'all.
Also, you've said that in the podcast, but not the episode. But
yeah. So, lots of ecumenical things.
Yeah. So, our first reading for this episode is from Acts chapter 1, verses 6 through 14. After Jesus ascends to heaven, the disciples return to Jerusalem and join in prayer with a gender-diverse group, including Jesus' family.
So, one of the themes for this passage is the idea of faith and learning, which Luther College alum will know very well, as we had, an entire center for faith and learning, faith and life, actually. But that was like our college ministries thing, was faith and learning. Embrace the cactus.
Yay, catchphrases. The catchphrase at Wartburg College was a spirited expression of our faith in learning, which is to say we did things as a spirited expression of our faith in learning. You can imagine what exciting things college students talked about doing as a spirited expression of our faith in learning.
I was going to say that brings to mind all sorts of possibilities.
All of them happened.
And Luther College is the one that had naked soccer, not Wartburg. So
we had some very enthusiastic rugby teams, but I think they were usually wearing at least pads. Otherwise, ow. But yes, faith and learning is important. Absolutely.
Mm-hmm. Indeed.
That was actually a catchphrase of the guy who happened to be president at the time. So I don't know that they still use that quite as enthusiastically at Wartburg.
That's fair. So the connection with faith and learning, aside from our respective colleges, reminded me of Wakanda in the first Black Panther movie.
Sure. Where
the culture of Wakanda is one where religious and faith practices are very important and traditions are very important, and also deep learning is very important, hence their like massive scientific advancement.
Yeah. So as we jump into the verses, we read in verse 6, "So when they had come together, they asked Jesus, 'Lord, is this the time when you will restore the kingdom to Israel?'" So, on the one hand, this does absolutely sound like the disciples are asking Jesus, "Are we there yet?" Like they're in the backseat of a car on the way to Disneyland. But on the other hand, let's be real, they have actually managed to wait until after the resurrection and literally seconds before Jesus' ascension back to heaven to ask about this extremely fundamental thing that they were very much expecting of the Messiah. So actually, this is an example of the disciples kind of being patient. I'm impressed. Like, that's not something they're usually very good at. So, good for them.
It's true, although I also say patience is a virtue I don't have. And, neither did Paul, really. But
you used to have patience, but you were a chaplain then.
That was terrible. Oh, that was so good. Bravo, okay, bravo. Moving on. In verse 8 we read Jesus telling the disciples, "But you will receive power when the Holy Spirit has come upon you, and you will be my witnesses in Jerusalem, in all Judea and Samaria, and to the ends of the earth." So basically to where the monsters dwell, because in that time the ends of the earth were like where all of the monsters were. So the myths, and some of them are in our Bibles, like Jonah, right, goes to the as far west as he can to escape God and gets swallowed up by a great big fish, some sort of sea monster.
Not a whale.
So not a whale. Nowhere does it say whale, folks. But yeah, so I was just like, oh, to the ends of the earth, where the monsters dwell. And now that's like,
yeah,
I don't know. I'm sure that there could be a great kids book about that. I'd read it.
I mean,
where the monsters dwell. I mean, where the wild things are
I
is
was
like
gonna say,
kind of that.
Yeah.
So maybe that's what I'm thinking of.
Or I was also thinking of the phrase, "Here there be dragons," that you used to see on the edges of old maps.
Yeah.
As sort of a decoration thing.
That's a good, yeah.
And then in verse 9, we read, "When Jesus had said this, as they were watching, Jesus was lifted up, and a cloud took him out of their sight." Okay, so if we're going to talk about ascension again, because we just did ascension, but apparently we're talking about ascension again. While
Yep.
my first instinct for God directly interacting with human beings is always going to be to picture it in a Monty Python decoupage style art kind of theory, I do also kind of like the combining in this verse, which I don't think I've noticed before, of the being picked up and then the cloud being what takes Jesus away here. And so I'm sort of thinking of like the cloud solidifying into a hand and then sort of scruffing Jesus like a baby kitten and taking Jesus up into heaven. And in which case, my question is, how long did it take for this cloud to solidify in order to do this? And were the disciples watching it happen just behind Jesus during most of the rest of this conversation before it actually got to the point where Jesus' feet left the ground? Because that sounds like God pulling a prank on Jesus, and I am on board for that. So, like, Jesus, I told you you were going to come back to heaven. I did not tell you how that was going to happen. Let's have some fun.
Right? That was a similar image to what I picked out. I specifically did not do verse 9 this week because I did it for Ascension Day, and we'll link to that if folks want to see it. But anybody that's seen Nope knows exactly what I was thinking of when I was like, and the cloud took Jesus out of their sight. Mm-hmm. And speaking of our Ascension Day episode, in verse 10, we read, "While Jesus was going and the disciples were gazing up towards heaven, suddenly 2 people in white robes stood by them." And that actually sounds, I didn't think of it or notice it in our Ascension Day episode because I had never heard the story.
Right.
But this time while I was reading it, I was like, that sounds a lot like what Lonnie Zamora saw in Socorro County, New Mexico in 1964. I'm just saying.
Yeah, absolutely.
And if you want that full story, again, check out our Ascension Day episode, which we will link to.
Maybe the egg ship was around a quarter or something.
Maybe it looked like a cloud.
Maybe.
Our second reading is from 1 Peter chapter 4, verses 12 through 14, and chapter 5, verses 6 through 11. The author encourages those who are suffering to remember God's promises and presence. And this reminded me, the way that the author is reminding them, right, is telling them about Christians throughout the world, and that it is a global movement. And so that made me think about Ethiopia and India as some of the earliest communities to become Christian, and now it's almost everywhere for better and for worse. And thinking about in the book Warcross, there's new technology that develops that like connects to your mind through your eyes, directly through your eyes, and that technology is developed and spreads globally for better and for worse, as we see when we read the book.
Yeah, or for
not
that matter,
everything global is good.
As we watch what happens with artificial intelligence in the world these days. Yeah.
Also that. Yep.
So most of the verses we chose for this reading are from chapter 5, but the first one is actually from chapter 4, verse 12. We read, "Beloved, do not be surprised at the fiery ordeal that is taking place among you to test you, as though something strange were happening to you." And so out of context...
A stranger thing, perhaps?
If they were playing D&D in the Bible, like, I missed that reference, but I would be up for finding out how that went. So, out of context, this verse can totally sound like the author is talking about God testing Christians by, like, doing stuff to them. But I believe that when you read this verse in the larger context of these chapters of 1 Peter, not just the selection that we're hearing for this episode, I believe that what this is actually talking about is more along the lines of what you're doing is literally what got Jesus crucified, so you shouldn't be that surprised that there are people objecting to you doing all this. Like, that is not... Yeah, that is not a twist ending. And so...
This is not the first time. This is not new.
Yeah, this is not our first rodeo. And so I would imagine that this would be much like the members of the First Order in the Star Wars universe were probably also not that surprised that a resistance grew up to fight against them, because that is literally what had just happened to the Empire, who they were trying to emulate at the time. So I hope that didn't surprise them, because otherwise they were maybe just a little on the not very bright side.
I mean, I like to think they were a little bit smarter than their ability to aim.
I mean, their ships did not seem to like fall apart of their own volition. You had to blow them up, as far as I could tell in the
It's true.
movies. But yeah,
It's true. It's true. Yeah. And then in chapter 5, verse 7, we read, "Cast all your anxiety on Jesus because Jesus cares for you." To which I say, all my anxieties? Because now I'm imagining like one of those shopping spree type situations with Jesus being like the person carrying all of the bags for the other person who's just like piling them on. I don't know that Jesus really wants that.
So, are you volunteering to make Jesus a Doc Ock style exosuit that has like 4 extra arms that he could carry anxieties with? That could be fun.
Oh, okay.
From Spider-Man.
Okay. Yeah. We could make Jesus into a supervillain.
Well,
Sounds good.
having extra arms doesn't necessarily make you a supervillain. We could just ask a supervillain to help.
It's true. Yeah, it's true. There's a TikToker who makes mystery octopus jars, and in the like Roll 4 series, and so now I'm picturing the octopus tentacles holding like
little shopping bags.
My anxieties as well. Yeah. It's adorable. Mm-hmm. And then in verse 8 we read, "Discipline yourselves, keep alert. Like a roaring lion, your adversary, the devil, prowls around looking for someone to devour." Hopefully it's a male lion because they don't hunt.
Yeah.
And if it were a female lion, you'd be a lot more likely to be devoured because they're the ones that actually kill and like provide the food for consumption. So, maybe that's why Daniel in the lion's den
didn't get eaten.
I mean, they're always depicted with manes.
With male lions, yeah. And it occurs to me that if the lion is roaring while hunting prey, like that does not sound like a very intelligent life choice. So maybe it is a male lion because they don't know how they do it. Yeah.
Yeah. Yep.
Okay.
Brilliant. I love our analysis of the
I mean, it's been a while since I've watched a documentary on lions, but I have watched a few of those, and yeah. So
I've watched a bunch on elephants, and there's some interaction between lions and elephants.
Sure.
So the elephants have always won because the documentary is about elephants.
Right. And then in verse 10 we read, "And after you have suffered for a little while, the God of all grace, who has called you to his eternal glory in Christ, will himself restore, support, strengthen, and establish you." So the book of 1 Peter, and also a few other books of the Bible, specifically the New Testament, and specifically the not Gospels New Testament in my experience, seem very fond of this whole comparing our very finite lives on this earth to the infinite amount of time that we will eventually have in the afterlife with God. And this comparison is usually made to remind us that our finite suffering is actually way less like cosmically important and also like just very short, functionally speaking, than we think that it is. But the trouble with making this comparison is that we don't have any experience with infinite anything yet. And so the promise kind of sounds empty in a lot of cases. And it sort of makes me think of when the Doctor in Doctor Who casually mentions to people he's just met that he has, met Shakespeare, or he's flirted with Queen Elizabeth, or any number of other
or
things.
Van Gogh.
That, just like he is, hundreds to thousands of years old, depending on where in the series you're watching him. And he's also pretty much always lying about how old he is. And so without context, what he says doesn't actually mean a heck of a lot and just sounds a little unhinged instead of being, helpful information. So I don't think this is a terribly useful comparison to make from the Bible, but I get that they tried, and I'm sure that there's probably like a Greek philosopher that they were trying to invoke when they did it, and I can't bring myself to care that much, but yeah. Sorry. This is not a piece of theology I really find useful. So
Solid.
And then our gospel reading for today is from John chapter 17, verses 1 through 11. Jesus prays for his disciples at the Last Supper on the night of his arrest.
So one of the themes in this passage is Jesus is talking about God's glory, and because this comes like right around Ascension, just to be clear, God's glory that Jesus is talking about is the cross and the crucifixion. It is not the Ascension, like we might be led to believe based on its placement in the lectionary. And it reminded me of the ways in the Divergent series that Triss, the protagonist, is the bravest when it calls for selflessness or self-sacrifice, a characteristic of, so bravery is a characteristic of the Dauntless faction, and selflessness, self-sacrifice is a characteristic of the Abnegation faction that she comes from. And so
Sure.
that space of like God's glory being in an unexpected place, and for her to be the most dauntless, she also has to be the most abnegation.
So as we jump into the verses, in verse 2 we read, "Since you have given Jesus authority over all people to give eternal life to all whom you have given Jesus." So, coincidentally,
Jesus speaking in the third person.
Yes, basically.
Confuses us all.
To God. Because talking to yourself isn't confusing enough in the first place.
Yep.
Which I do regularly, to be entirely honest. But so coincidentally,
Sure.
I just talked about Jesus' temptation in the desert with my confirmation students this week. And so the parallel here between what God has given Jesus and what the devil tried to promise Jesus is kind of interesting to me. Because, of course, in the temptation in the desert, the authority over all people is exactly what the devil tried to give Jesus, with a gigantic, "if you worship me" price tag attached to it.
Mm-hmm.
And God apparently has already given that to Jesus here. And so it's almost like where and who and how you get your power from makes a difference. Just ask Anakin Skywalker / Darth Vader, I guess.
Yeah. Also, okay, I just gotta say, in the realm of hashtag shameless plugs, it sounds like you're getting ready for Horror Nerds at Church's Revenge of the 6th season. You just keep having Star Wars references. So
it just worked out.
Well, there's
week.
more than one, so I just have to throw in, and we will link so folks can see the amazingness that was that announcement and the delightfulness.
Sure.
Part amazing and part just hilarious.
I mean, on that note, I suppose I should ask how you're feeling, because I think it's been at least 3 episodes since you brought up Lumbus bread. So
it's true. It's true. It's been a while. Lumbus bread. Yeah, it's because I've been in Divergent Land.
That's absolutely true. Yes.
Yeah, but speaking of Star Wars, in verse 5, as Jesus continues to pray, we read, "So now, Abba, glorify me in your own presence with the glory that I had in your presence before the world existed." So we're having a Jesus as Sophia / woman wisdom moment here, which we covered last year, and we'll link to that, our episode on wisdom in the Bible. But this is also a great way to start the prequels, right? And then we that I had in your presence before the world existed, and then fade to pre-beginning creation. Or it could be a machete order Bible thing, kind of like the machete order in Star Wars.
We could use one of those.
Have a little bit, and then shoop back to this, and then shoop back to what comes from there.
Yeah. In a way that actually is helpful for storytelling, rather than just trying to put the books of the Bible in the chronological order that they were written in, which is way more confusing than you'd expect.
It's true.
And then in verse 9 we read, "I am asking on their behalf. I am not asking on behalf of the world, but on behalf of those whom you gave me, because they are yours." I seem to keep coming back to this verse, but I'm talking about it in a different way this year. I do love this verse. So actually, for the vast majority of his ministry, Jesus was asking for things on behalf of the whole world. 3 years of walking around and talking about God loving the whole world. It was a theme. And at this point, finally, just before he's about to go off and, well, frankly, get crucified and die, Jesus has switched gears into specifically asking for things for his friends and students and disciples. And as I was thinking about that, it reminded me that those of us who have accompanied people who are actively dying have probably witnessed a certain tunneling in of the focus of the person who is dying as death gets closer, and the larger cares of the world usually fade in those last few days. And I have to say, I find it both interesting and also very human to see that it seems like Jesus is going through some of that too.
Yeah. I have also, this year especially, that hit me as a response to Jesus having not been present in that way for Mary and Martha when Lazarus dies.
Yeah.
And I think that's also a great learning too, a growth.
Yeah.
Look, even Jesus grows.
Yay.
And then in verse 11 we read, "And now I am no longer in the world, but they are in the world, and I am coming to you, Holy Abba. Protect them in your name that you have given me, so that they may be one as we are one. So in this prayer, Jesus is talking about uniting. And these days, it seems like unjust labor practices seem to be doing a lot of uniting of the working class right now.
Funny
and
how
I
that
am
works.
here for this. Yeah. From the Writers Guild strike to, I saw that the Southwest pilots just authorized a strike. There's Iowa finally got the first unionized Starbucks in the state. What? Yeah. And the Teamsters, of course, are amazing and help,
as always,
with all strikes to be like, yeah, we don't cross picket lines. And it's amazing.
Mm-hmm.
And I love it. So, yay, unions!
Indeed.
And now for our most unifying in diversity segment.
Crossing boundaries. Bridging differences.
Bringing together diverse people. Our segment that most brings together diversity.
Our segment that is a joint musical declaration on the doctrine of Muppets.
Muppetification. Let's make a Muppets musical,
Absolutely.
Folks. Okay, what have you got for us?
Well, okay, we just did Ascension, as I complained about a minute ago, and so I refused to cast something for the first reading. And so instead, because the second reading is not really much of a story, I jumped to the Gospel. And I was thinking about the disciples gathered for the Last Supper, and they are the core 12, as it were. And I was wondering, who are the core Muppets? And I bet that we would all probably have slightly different lists of who are the core Muppets to us.
Kind of like we had slightly different lists for the disciples in our disciples episode this year.
Very likely, yes, absolutely. So, yeah, I think we would all probably expect Kermit and Miss Piggy to be on the list of the central Muppets, absolutely, the core Muppets. And also, the core Muppets wouldn't necessarily have 12 or 13 Muppets. And some of us might want to include some Sesame Street characters on that list as well, like Big Bird and
Oscar the Grouch
and Cookie Monster. But also, like, I can't imagine the Muppets without Fozzie Bear and Rolf playing music. And so who the core Muppets are is going to be a little different for all of us. But we can all be one in celebrating the Muppets.
That's fantastic. I definitely am hardcore Oscar the Grouch, but as you were saying it, I was like, Fozzie Bear. Also Gonzo.
Yes, Gonzo. Absolutely.
How do you have the disciples without Gonzo? Let's be real.
And like my deep and abiding love of the Swedish Chef, I realize is not necessarily something I share with all of humanity. But that's just because
somebody's got to cook that Last Supper.
Yeah, exactly. And they might have had chicken.
Those people.
Like, listen, I'm willing to work with people even when they're wrong. If I wasn't, I wouldn't, have done literally anything in my life. So.
Just don't let Gonzo hear you say that.
Oh, Gonzo isn't wrong, usually, for the most part.
No,
slightly misguided.
The part about having chicken.
Well, yes.
That's fantastic, and I love that. I'm glad that I added in a couple of those, because you can't miss out on Oscar the Grouch. And of course, Cookie Monster would make sure that everybody gets dessert.
Exactly. And let's be honest, Cookie Monster would totally stuff a couple of cookies into Judas's pocket as he walked out. Like, that is just who Cookie Monster is.
It's true. It's true. Yeah.
How about you, Emily?
Well, I definitely am adding Oscar the Grouch into this casting, I think. Oh, yeah. But I hadn't thought of it quite the way that you do. But now I feel like we did cast Judas at one point.
I think we cast Judas as people. I don't think we cast Judas as a Muppet.
That's
Judas
fair.
is always the token human.
Because, yeah. I think John Oliver, actually, so we did.
Yeah. Technically speaking, if we wanted to cast a Muppet as Judas, I would be willing to jump to the movie Who Framed Roger Rabbit and cast the judge as Judas, because he was a toon and he was the only evil toon. Spoiler alerts for Who Framed Roger Rabbit. You don't find that out until the very end. But
interesting. That's a fair point. Also, I was thinking about Elmo, and I know some people are not huge fans of Elmo, or Elmo's voice grates on them.
He's a sweetie.
I just have this deep love for Elmo. Yeah. Elmo doesn't use pronouns for Elmo's self. So, in the non-binary world, go Elmo. But also,
no one wants to exclude Elmo.
Oh, no. But also, as Kay and I know lately, the way that The Merriam-Webster dictionary, I don't know who's in charge of it, of their Twitter account these
They
days,
have been having fun.
Spectacular. Oscar the Grouch, like, explained that being grouchy is not the same as being angry, and the dictionary, like, responded and was like, yeah, you're right. These are the two definitions. And then Oscar and Cookie Monster have both requested to be on the page next to particular words. Oscar the Grouch next to Grouch, Cookie Monster next to Cookie. And they, like, came up, like, they created, like, fake dictionary pages for each of them. Cookie Monster is visible on Monster, not Cookie. But Oscar the Grouch is visible on Grouch.
Yes.
And it's just adorable.
That was wonderful.
Yeah, I love that.
Speaking of reaching across boundaries to share love.
Indeed. And I think that, like, maybe the Merriam-Webster dictionary is like Jesus, and everybody gets, like, their own pictures.
And dispensing truth wherever it goes.
Exactly.
Because having vocabulary to describe yourself and things and people is helpful.
Indeed.
So, thanks for joining us. Catch us next time when we'll discuss nerdery connections to the scripture readings for Pentecost. This podcast has been produced by us, Kay Rohloff and Emily Ewing. For more fun, check us out on Twitter and Facebook at Nerds at Church, or contact us at nerdsatchurch@gmail.com.
Also, if you like what you've heard, rate us or leave us a review on Apple Podcasts, Facebook, or wherever you catch your podcasts. If you want access to our uncut guest episodes and interviews, live Q&As, and more, including, potentially, our movie commentary on 4 Weddings and a Funeral.
If we remember it for the next 5 minutes.
Yeah, but I remembered it this time, so we're closer. Support us on Patreon at patreon.com/nerdsatchurch. It's cheaper than flying ecumenical leaders all together to be present for conversations that may or may not lead anywhere about ecumenism.
Sure, and possibly risking COVID in the process.
Exactly. Yeah.
Also, let us know on Facebook or Twitter who you would cast for Let's Make a Muppets musical for this episode.
As the ancient Christian said,
Pax vobiscum.